Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Jennifer Richards, and I'm Managing Director of Aon's Specialties business in Australia. As the title of our webinar today suggests, our goal is to help you understand how to prepare for what is inevitable now, a cyber claim. Much has been said and written about the rise of cyber risk during the pandemic, with a recent report concluding that a cyber offensive against Australia could be more impactful and costly than the pandemic itself. In this context, today's session is really timely. Cyber insurance is one of the fastest growing classes of insurance as Australian companies ready themselves for a cyber incident and seek support from the insurance market. As we will stress today, buying a cyber policy is a critical step, but only one aspect of the equation. We're going to talk to you today about how companies need to prepare for the inevitable and position themselves for a swift and comprehensive response from their cyber insurance policies. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, Jody, we'll just, first of all, before we get going, just deal with a little bit of housekeeping. Today's session is being recorded. You've joined in listen-only mode, but we would like to keep this interactive. So please do ask questions throughout the presentation using the questions window on your control panel. We'll endeavor to get through these questions as we progress, but if we don't get to anything, we'll make sure we get to them at the end. First of all, I'd like to introduce our presenters and thank them very much for joining us today. First, we've got Chris McLaughlin. Chris leads Aon Cyber Solutions Group in Australia and our cyber advisory services across APAC. Chris provides advice to Aon's client to drive better risk outcomes and integrate cyber risk into enterprise risk processes. Michael Perrant is Aon's Cyber Insurance Practice Group leader. And he's been intimately involved in leading the cyber insurance risk transfer strategy and placement for many of Australia's largest companies. And he also has a wealth of experience in helping clients with complex claims. John Moran is a recognized expert in the cyber risk and incident response space, leading one of the largest dedicated cyber incident response teams in ANZ. His team has advised on over 1,000 cyber incidents in recent times, both locally and globally. Molly Day. Molly is Accenture's ANZ Cyber Threat Intelligence Lead and is part of the iDefense Geopolitical and Strategic Intelligence team. She's an experienced intelligence professional with a background in law enforcement, anti-corruption, and information security. And finally, Mark Sayer. Mark is the APAC Cyber Defense Lead with an Accenture security practice. Mark has over 20 years experience in the information security industry, specializing in the design, implementation, and operation of a wide range of security systems. If we could move to the next slide, please. Great, we're going to jump right into our materials today, and we thought we'd kick off our discussion with some lessons learned from recent cyber claims, just to set the stage for our discussion today and level set. I'm going to turn it over to Chris now to take us through his observations around pitfalls when managing your cyber claim. Chris?
Thanks, Jen. And yeah, so over the last I think 18 months, we've seen more and more sophisticated attacks against Australian organisations, leading to significant losses, and then obviously, the subsequent claims process that we move into, through the insured. And there's some key pitfalls that we've found over the last 18 months. That have been pretty common across all of the claims that we've managed and dealt with. So in no particular order, we can start off with Betterment. In terms of the policies, Betterment's not particularly included. It's about reconstitution of your systems and data to the state prior to the incident or loss occurring. What we're finding now is a lot of organizations are looking to try and improve their security posture as part of the claims process, and trying to make the argument that putting in additional technologies or moving from legacy systems to a new platform is actually part of the policy, where it's not. And so we're seeing a key area for organizations to focus on is around how we attack this Betterment argument with the insurers, and it all plays into what we're going to talk about through the rest of the presentation. around how you work closer with all of your partners, how you work better with your broker, with your insurance, your incident response partner, and other partners involved in the end-to-end process of managing the incident through to claim settlement. The second one is around adjustment. What we see is the lack of openness and transparency around the adjustment process. Lack of clarity sometimes on agreement between the insured and the insurer around who they're going to use for adjustment, and the overall process that's undertaken, and the independence issues that are potentially surround that lack of communication between the insured as they're going through the incident, the insurer and the adjuster, in order to make sure that everybody's on board with what's happening, and you have continual agreement rather than, wait until the end of the process and then, having elongated arguments. I'm not going to touch too much on incident response because both John and Mark will touch on this in more detail. But really, one of the areas that we see as critical for organisations to manage the claims process is to have that robust incident response process in place that's practiced amongst all parties involved. If you don't do that, that leads to much greater issues later on. The claims prep expenses, as we know that insurers, as part of the policies, provide resources in terms and funding in terms of the expenses to prepare the claim. But one of the things that we have in terms of the experience and what we've seen over the last sort of 12, 18 months is that that's not always sufficient in order to prepare the claim appropriately. We've seen claims prep expenses within policies from anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000, but there has to be an understanding from the insureds that claims prep is complex. It becomes more complicated as the sophistication of the attacks and the sort of multidisciplinary types of attacks that we're seeing across organizations. It's not as simple as it was, and having that ability to work with partners who have experience of the sort of business interest is really important. And finally, on the sort of policy wording, I think, again, it's all of the stakeholders within the organization really need to understand what the policy is meant to be doing and how it's going to react to an incident. I think a lot of times that we see that, sort of the chief security officers or IT aren't really across the policy, so don't really know how they're going to react, and they don't know the process that needs to be followed. So there's a couple of areas in there, I think, that I want to bring in Mick's expertise from a technical perspective, just to provide some opinions. And I think that the first thing we talked about, Mick, was around sort of betterment and what that means in terms of the waiting periods and periods of cover, and how insurers are actually responding to the issues of betterment.
Yeah, sure. It's a challenging point, Chris, because the tenet of insurance is to put you into the position you were in just prior to the event. But insurers have, along the journey, realized that that's not really good enough for anyone. So there is this loose understanding, very loose understanding, that insurers are prepared in some instances to improve systems to make them slightly more resilient than what they were in prior to the incident. And we should stipulate that no insurer has an absolute position on this. It is a very fluid point, and unfortunately it's causing a lot more concern in the market as it is right now. But as we sit here, as we talk to it, we can say that insurers are somewhat okay with a slight improvement in system and somewhat in better security than may have existed directly before the incident. But the addition of additional items that did not exist beforehand, that's where insurers start really getting quite scrutinizing the costs and the implementation of such. So getting an understanding of that before an incident with an insurer, what systems you have, what protocols you've got in place, is becoming more and more important, and trying to identify why these items such as Betterment may be more important than you think, but explaining in a fashion to insurers that this is not necessarily a lack of risk management that the company has, but rather an item that needs to be addressed to remediate risk immediately for all.
Mike, do you
Thanks,
have
Matt.
do you have an example of a recent issue that you've dealt with in this regard in terms of a betterment issue?
Yeah. I've seen this actually time and time again now, to be honest, Jen, where companies have an incident, it happens, and everyone goes into a bit of a panic mode. Clients will look to engage with a number of vendors, and different vendors will come in and say, great, I can help you by delivering X, Y, and Z, whatever that might be. Now, if you haven't had a closer link with your insurer, if you haven't had a closer engagement with their panel providers, these vendors will come in and offer you all of these particular services. If you were to do that with the insurer's panel member, what they will typically say is, we're still giving you this access to the same services and products. However, please be aware that item X is not likely to be covered under your policy. So if we go through the process of a client who has engaged in the full engagement with all party members, whoever that might be, there's a bit of an expectation being built from the start as to what is covered, what is fair and reasonable under the policy, where the policy might start to be a little bit more complicated, and then what is clearly not covered. If you haven't had that engagement, you might find that these parties are doing everything in the right fashion, but the insured's expectation that this is going to be covered by the policy becomes more problematic. A great example would be engagement with experts who come in and improve security, apply security that did not exist prior to. Examples can include endpoint protection that did not exist beforehand. That is the sort of thing that can be scrutinized. Some insurers will say, look, we can see why you're doing that. We might do a part payment. Other insurers might say, that's not part of what we're expecting. And unfortunately, with the claims coming through, and they are getting worse and worse on a daily basis, there's going to be more and more scrutiny on that.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I think, Mike, there was sort of one other thing that we discussed sort of previously as we were sort of managing some of these claims, and it was around the sort of policy wording that the market in cyber insurance is going to be hardening, and that's going to have a material impact on how insurers start reacting to incidents and the level of evidences that they're going to require, not just for the betterment question, but again, for the expertise and skills that are being used when sort of managing the claim. And how do you see this coming through in the policy wording that the insurers are going to insist on?
Yeah. So this is just my speculation. I don't know this. I haven't heard it, but I can see, the history of the cyber insurance has been a slow evolution of education. Help clients along the journey, give them advice along the journey, give them access to vendors that we have probably on cheaper rates, faster engagements than you will be able to get in the commercial environment. So that's where we've been. But everything I'm hearing with the claims coming through thick and thin, literally on a daily basis, I can predict a world where insurers will start to move from an education to an enforcement regime, which is we will now start applying requirements within the policy to say you must do A, you must do B during an incident, which will be you must engage with our vendors. If you don't, it will be at your cost. If you don't do X, Y, and Z, it will likely not be covered by the policy. And that's not to say that clients aren't doing the right thing and not that those vendors aren't doing the right thing, but it's about a disalignment of expectations. And insurers who have now been saying for a long time, these issues are getting worse and worse. But unfortunately, more often than not, the incidents that we're seeing arising are still from somewhat easy matters that could have been mitigated with appropriate controls in the first place, or at least diminished from an exposure perspective. Insurers will start saying this is now a cost that we did not anticipate when we provided you with terms and conditions. So I think that is the world is that insurers will start saying you must do A and you must do B.
Thanks, Mike. And just sort of on a final word for pitfalls, I'd just like to bring in John to see if you have any sort of final comments around, what you've seen being in the thick of, some of these incidents and claims.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and a big thank you to the Aon team for inviting us along today. It's been a really good discussion so far. I'm going to try not steal my own thunder when I talk later on, but to answer your question, I think probably the most important thing to flag to clients is there's two halves to any incident. There's the incident itself, so there's the security issue or whatever happened, or the ransomware event, whatever that is, and then the other half is your response. And typically businesses are no longer judged on, or most critically judged on the incident itself. They're judged on how they responded. And we say this to clients in the very first call when we talk to them, that what's happened has happened and you're going to figure that out. But the real test for you right now is to how do you fare in the time of a crisis? And that is the public forum. It's in front of the public forum. It's in front of your customers, your stakeholders. And if you get that wrong, our experience is that customers and key clients, key stakeholders, they're not forgiving of that. They might be forgiving of an incident happening because they themselves might have suffered an incident. But if you don't get the response right, it causes reputational damage.
And I think, John, the Red Cross example is just such a perfect example of that. They spoke at our annual conference, maybe it was a couple years ago now, and it's just such an inspiring story about when you get the response right, and what a difference it makes to an organization. So I think that point is really, really well made. And we're going to speak a little bit later in the presentation about incident response, and sort of have a robust discussion around that, which you're going to lead as well, John. So we might just move briefly into a quick discussion just around claims protocols, and invite Michael again to take us through this. And I think really here, Michael, just talk us through what is a good claims protocol, and why is it so critically important?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So everyone can see in front of you here a bit of a puzzle, if you will, of the different constituent components of an incident. And I think really maybe quite an appropriate analogy is the claims protocol is the bringing together of that jigsaw. Each and every single one of those items in front of you there are items that can be done in isolation, under your own direction if needed. But the claims protocol helps to bring that jigsaw together. Most importantly, and as I suggested a bit earlier, it's about bringing together an awareness, starting to align expectations between insurers and expectation of client and expectation of vendors. Insurers don't like surprises. Insurers don't mind paying claims, but they like to be involved and have an understanding and have certain expectations met from everyone. And that is no comment that the clients are doing the wrong thing or that the vendors are doing the wrong thing, but rather that things will evolve. And as they do, insurers like to be seeing that there's a bit of a roadmap, if you will, that these certain expectations will be met. So what that claims protocol does is it brings clarity and certainty to the actions of all parties that are involved in this approach. What it really does, and this is what I think is the most important part, is it really brings the key executives to the table prior to an incident to say, well, we now acknowledge that an incident's going to happen. Who are we going to call upon? Who is important to us, both internally and externally, to start managing these processes and issues, bringing that onto a document, a live document, which says to your insurer, we are taking these particular actions. Do you agree? Insurers will then say yes or no. If they say no, well, what is an appropriate step? And all of a sudden, we're starting to get these two worlds coming together. So I use the analogy in a separate discussion that this claims protocol and incident response are the opposite sides of the same coin. They are really bringing that holistic approach to incident response, to claims preparation together so that there are as few surprises as possible. Insurers can then, once there's a plan, insurers will appreciate that things need to change in the heat of the moment and that things might adapt as time goes by. But if you've got that plan and you've stuck to it to a reasonably good position, insurers are then going to be far more flexible when things need to go slightly awry and fewer expectations around problems start to arise. So from my point of view, as much as companies will do incident response training, business continuity plans training and testing, and disaster recovery plan training and testing, this goes hand in hand and it brings the insurer and the panel members along the journey so that, again, building expectations and reducing complications.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael, for that. That's a very helpful and sort of sets the stage very well for our next section, which is a discussion around incident response and the claims process. And I think, John, you made the point before around the importance of how a client responds to the incident and how it's separate from the incident itself. It'd be really good if you could take us through your observations as to the interconnection between incident response and the claims process, and the critical things that clients need to make sure they do right in order to be on the right side of that equation, so to speak.
Yeah, great, Jen, and thanks for that. It's a really good question. Some great points from Michael and from Chris, and I'll probably do those to death and repeat some of those, but I think it's worth making the point as robustly as we can. So the question around the interaction between incident response and the claims protocol or the claims piece, I think it's probably important first maybe to set the scene around what I do and what firms like us, what we do in the role of a breach coach or an incident response manager or whatever your insurer or Aon might call us. We essentially sit centrally with the insured, with you, with Aon, with the insurer, with vendors like Accenture, and a whole raft of other vendors from different specialities, and help you manage that incident. Now, we fully recognize that no two businesses will suffer in the same way from the same incident, and no two businesses have the same capability to deal with an incident type. So it's never cookie cutter, although it can be cookie cutter. So if a business is struggling and they just need something off the shelf in terms of the incident response piece, we can guide them through that. And the likes of Accenture and other vendors, they will also have very standardized processes depending on the incident type. But the point there really is having somebody sit centrally in that role. A lot of businesses think that they don't need it until they realize that they need it. And it's becoming more of a more common feature in incident response. We're seeing fewer clients decide to go it alone. Those clients who think that they can manage through it and get through it from A to Z without any assistance at all, the percentage of those clients is diminishing. I think most clients recognize that even to have somebody just sitting on the sidelines and shouting at them, picking up on the expression used earlier on, or in pitfalls to avoid certain issues, or to maybe round a corner where they don't need to be as detailed or as stuck on a particular point, or just to get some lessons learned on the commercial realities of dealing with a certain incident type. The role is becoming more and more challenging, more involved, and we're seeing more clients take up the offer of a breach coach, which is excellent, and it definitely delivers better outcomes. Chris,
just a quick question on the breach coach piece. In terms of the legal aspect of it, is there an important consideration just around privilege and the fact, in terms of who a party chooses for a breach coach, in terms of actually protecting in the event that there's litigation in respect of the cyber claim?
For the audience, I promise that I'm not paying Jen to ask that question.
No.
but it is a good question. Listen, we are a law firm at the end of the day, and I say it with full awareness of what people think of lawyers, that they look and feel of what we do. We try not to be lawyers. I put on a shirt today for the first time because I was trying to impress you guys, but typically the look and feel of what we do.
Just to be clear, you normally wear a shirt, it's just not a collared shirt.
True, exactly. Not anyway, we'll keep moving. We're there to assist you to kind of deal with the operational issues, and I'll touch on that in a couple of minutes' time. But I suppose the client, the insured, has the benefit of knowing that our engagement and us sitting on top of the incident to help you structure the response, bringing in vendors like Accenture, allows us to package up the whole incident response piece, package up the investigation under legal professional privilege. And the best way of describing legal professional privilege and the reasons that it's important is really, it's only important when you don't have it. And sadly, we've experienced clients who have decided to bring in the vendor, conduct it themselves. Perhaps the report is not commissioned under legal professional privilege. And maybe a couple of months later, when they're dealing with a regulator or they're dealing with key stakeholders or litigation, in fact, they're discovering that they may have to disclose that report and they had not anticipated that they would. So it gives you options and opportunities. And in the US and other jurisdictions globally, it's just run the mill. That is what happens. The law firm will get involved and help you structure that. And as I said earlier on, that can be all singing, all dancing, and helping you with the full piece, right through to a lighter touch, helping you structure the engagement and help you guide your own team to manage it. But going back to the earlier question, Jen, around the interaction between incident response and the claims process, I think the key piece to stress is, and Michael has mentioned it earlier on, is engagement, and that needs to be early engagement. We love to speak to a client before they've had an incident, but sadly, 95% of the clients that we speak to for the first time is at the time of an incident. And at that time, we're figuring out who they are, how do you fit in the business, what's your role, who sits above you, who sits below you, how do you interact with the incident response team, do you in fact have an incident response plan? All of these questions play out in real time in a crisis. And it's super challenging for an organization because they want to get on with it. They know that that this incident may be having an operational impact. They may not be able to access their emails. They may not be able to service clients. They may not be able to manufacture. And all of this playing out in real time is super, super stressful. And it prolongs the life of an incident. So early engagement, bringing the dial way back before the incident is critical. Having a discussion with the Aon and saying, hey, we want to meet some people. We want to get to know our panel vendors. A really great point from Michael earlier on. You go,
yeah,
Jen.
just in that regard, we've actually had a question come through on that exact topic. We've had a question come through from the audience saying, are we seeing organizations run through mock cyber attack scenarios with insurance department and consultants involved? So in that planning piece, is that something that you're seeing?
Yep, absolutely. It's becoming more frequent. We'd love to see more of it. I'm not going to say that everybody's doing it, but this idea of a desktop exercise, or you might hear it called a simulation, actually sitting down with your incident response plan, or you might have playbooks or whatever that looks like, and actually stepping through how the incident might unfold, who does what, when they do it, what are the types of pitfalls or blind spots that perhaps you haven't anticipated, and actually going through the plan. A plan on paper just really isn't that much use if you haven't tested it. I think that's the key message for clients. We're definitely seeing a big uptick in that, Jen.
Great.
Just the last one. I know I've overstretched it about the early engagement piece, but those clients who decide to go it alone are in the minority, and that's exactly what we're seeing. There's often a perception that perhaps Accenture or Clyde & Co, if we're on the insurer panel, that we're there for the insurer. We can't do enough to try and bust that myth. We're there for the insured. We're there with the broker. We're there to help you get through this. You have full control over that engagement. You have full control over that relationship. You, as Michael has said, you get better rates, you get more efficiencies, it's faster. But it can be difficult to explain that to a client at the time of an incident, because a client might take comfort in relationships they already have. So again, not to overstress it, but getting to know your breach coach, getting to know your incident response manager, getting to know your panel vendors before an incident is absolutely critical.
And John, you said it earlier as well, which I just thought was something to really pick up on. Business continuity plans, testing them, training, proving that they exist. So some insurers will write cyber insurance with only a handful of questions, depending on size of organization and complexity of organization, a handful of questions. But one of those requirements is that companies have BCP plans, business continuity plans, just that they exist. I can honestly foresee within 12 to 24 months, the next iteration of that will be, you must have those in place and you must be testing them. Like you must. We maybe don't need to see the documentation at this point in time, but if an incident arises and it becomes evolved or it becomes obvious that you have not been testing these plans, then we will have problems, because this is the low-hanging fruit, the low-hanging risk management protocols that companies should be adopting. And under other lines of insurance, under other exposures, these sorts of things are tested and tried a bit more frequently. We've been doing it for a long, long time. It's just within this cyberspace, within this intangible space, people haven't been thinking about it. So again, my earlier comment, insurers have been educating. We will move to an enforcement, but the enforcement will be around that low-hanging. This is the basic risk management that companies really need to do, which some organizations are still not yet fully up to speed with.
And Michael and
really
John, we've had another question come in just on this topic as well. A question asking if cyber insurance insurers tend to fund pre-loss work, like helping with cost of running mock recalls involving panel members by way of example.
Yeah, I might start with that and then hand back to John if you don't, if you're happy with that. So from my point of view, yes and no. A lot of insurers have gone through a process of in-housing a lot of additional risk management tools. So many insurers will now say, as a part of our insured panel, you now have access to these resources, and some of those resources will be improved incident response plans, improved risk management plans, and some other basic hygiene. Some clients will potentially then maybe more when you start getting to the larger spectrum, there might be some adjustment that they can provide around providing you with actual incident response training and testing. Again, I wouldn't be surprised to see within 12 to 24 months that that's almost a condition of insurance that you do this sort of thing. So maybe potentially moving away from a an education/funding arrangement for that to an enforcement regime, because it is, again, that critical piece of just do this basic work and you are a better risk, full stop.
Right.
And again,
So it's about making yourself insurable and controlling your premiums.
Yep, I definitely think that, yeah. John, your thoughts
John,
on
did
that?
you have any observations on that?
Yeah, I'd just add to that, and Jen, I'm going to steal a phrase that I've heard you use in the past, which is kind of a liability mindset. This idea of, a cyber insurance policy being something that, you deal with the incident, you get on, you figure out what the financial impact is, and then you pass it on to the insurer, like you might with perhaps some other lines of business. Whereas really this is about engagement. Your insurer wants to be there with you at the time of writing the policy. As Michael has said, they want to understand, how are you going to deal with the incident? How are you going to respond? But critically, at the time of the incident, they also want to be involved. They want to be involved, and they can very easily determine those clients that have rehearsed an incident and haven't rehearsed an incident. It's very, very clear. So I totally agree. I think we're going to get to a space pretty soon where the expectation is that you have rehearsed this. Believe it or believe it not, we have rehearsed this webinar. Most people, if they're giving a presentation, will practice something. It blows me away how many times a client just actually hasn't thought through or actually hasn't sat down and prepped, even with an hour with their senior team, senior management, to say, in the time of a crisis, this is what we'll do. That's what you'll say. That's what we will say. This is who we'll bring in to help us. It only needs to be an hour.
Could we just, on that topic, John and Mark, just in terms of the timeline, on the bottom of the slide here, we've got just a bit of a depiction of a timeline. And Mark, you had shared some interesting anecdotes about an incident that you've been working on with the Clyde & Co team, just around giving the audience a sense of how intensive these exercises can be. Do you want to maybe share that anecdote?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's mixed and varied, and what we're finding more often than not these days, and I think, Chris alluded to this earlier in the discussion, that the complexity of some of these attacks is increasing, the sophistication of attackers is increasing. And so when you start, you might see a fairly simple, it could be a ransomware or a DDoS extortion, for example. But what often happens is we dig into it, we find out that there's much more under the surface. The attackers might have been in there for a long period of time. And so what appears to be a fairly simple incident that the IT security team think that they could probably handle within 24, 48 hours can suddenly become a 5-day exercise, becomes a 6-week exercise, and then all of a sudden we've been going at it for 3 months. And I think that's one of the things that catches a lot of organizations out when they start this process, is they assume it's going to be a lot smaller than what it turns out to be.
And I think your observation was just around this piece about people getting in the mindset that it could be a very drawn out or a longer engagement, and people preparing and planning for that insofar as a time commitment that people really do need to anticipate that it could be it could last for months and if not years as they manage the claim into the future.
That's absolutely right. And one of the things, I often find is a lot of organizations will typically try and go it alone. So they'll have their IT security department. Everyone thinks this is an IT problem, so we'll let IT sort it out. So the engineers get involved. They're working 24/7. They've been going at it 3, 4, 5 days before they realize that they need help. Everyone's exhausted. Everyone's burnt out. And that's when they reach out for that external help. And I think, one of the things we've learned through going through this process many, many hundreds of times is, even from that early outset, starting to plan the workforce, making sure that we've got fresh people coming in a couple of days' time who can pick up, making sure that people aren't working 24/7, because you can't sustain that for more than a few days. And actually being able to manage a workforce in a crisis that is going to be able to act effectively, for the longer term, not just for a few days, I think is really important.
Excellent. Great. Well, we might move on just to a discussion just about the threats themselves, and ask Accenture to share some observations. We'll get the other panelists to chip in as well, just around the incident and the threat itself. How important is it to understand the nature of the threat in order to link it in and afford the best possible claims process? And Mark and Molly are now going to share their observations in that regard.
Sure, thanks, Jen. I guess you know what we sort of, when we discussed this internally, I sort of gave the story. It's like there's a show on Discovery Channel called Air Crash Investigations, and you know I do a lot of flying, and so I have this morbid sort of fascination with these air crash investigations. And one of the things that I learned from watching that show is that every major catastrophe, you know, is usually the result of a small number of control failures that sort of chain together. And often when we're investigating these cyber attacks, we find it's the same. It's rarely ever one thing that's happened. It's usually multiple small things that have happened. And what that means is, both from the investigation perspective, and we were just talking about this kind of in terms of the complexity, but both from the investigation perspective, but also the claims process perspective, you know, in those initial 48 hours when you're sort of leaning into responding to one of these cyber attacks, it's often not immediately obvious exactly what you're dealing with. And so often as those investigations play out, we start to pull threads and we find more things. You know, we might have originally thought we were dealing with a ransomware attack, but it turns out there's been a threat actor in the environment for 6 months stealing data. And so, you know, it's really important, both from that investigation process from a technical standpoint, but also for managing your claim and your communications with the insurer, that these things evolve over time. And so it's about keeping that communication and managing those expectations and keeping everyone across these things, how they unfold. The other thing that sort of strikes me, and sort of again ties into this same theme, is that the immediate scale of cyber attacks is often not understood. You know, when we typically get engaged, it might be because a particular organization has found, you know, ransomware on a couple of servers, or they've found some evidence that a threat actor has put a remote access Trojan on a server. And so the focus of their investigation is on that server and how they got onto that server. And I think, you know, as we again get into these investigations and we start to pull the threads, you find more often than not that actually these attacks are much more wide scale than what is initially anticipated. And I think there's some really good perspective for organizations who haven't had the experience of going through one of these incidents to keep that in mind. And I often find, you know, my role in sort of the incidents is helping, you know, the client, as well as my own incident response team, to step out of the weeds and look at the bigger picture, because there's always a bigger picture at play, and make sure we're looking at all the different angles, not just the things that are immediately obvious. I think one of the other things that also strikes me, you know, again, thinking commonly we're getting engaged, you know, 3, 4, 5 days into an incident response by the time that the client actually engages us. One of the critical things that I couldn't stress enough is to be careful about preserving the forensic artifacts from that initial response in the first 24 hours. Some of the things that we see organizations do, they'll reach out to their vendors, and quite often vendors, in terms of giving guidance, will be telling them to upgrade. You know, oh, there's a known vulnerability in that particular system, so upgrade it, or fix this, or put this new product down. The other thing we commonly see is that they'll turn the volume of logging up. So we're going to start logging more data and capturing more data, but they don't increase the storage. And so what then tends to happen is we start overwriting forensic artifacts. When we're upgrading systems or restoring from backups or overwriting logs, we're starting to lose important forensic information which happened before the immediacy of the incident that we're investigating. And so that can really hinder our ability to understand, again, the full scale of the incident that we're investigating. And one of the other things that I think a lot of organizations, again, don't factor in is using threat intelligence as part of the incident response process. And what we've found is that, you know, bringing that external view, and again, you know, you see a small part of what's happening in your network, being able to augment that with information from outside of your organization can actually have a really big impact in how fast, how effectively you can recover, and then also managing through that claims process.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Mark. I mean, in our experience, you touched on it already. So the initial incident response is typically like the iceberg, right? So you see the tip of the iceberg in those initial kind of days, but when you use intelligence, then you use that to uncover more of what lies beneath. So using that earlier on in the process helps organizations to make more informed strategic decisions about how they're going to handle that incident response. So if you're one of those organizations who is using intelligence before an attack, it helps you understand and better prepare for it, because you're aware of what's going on in your industry and your geography. So you know which other companies are being hit, which threat actors are hitting them, and then you're in a position to better prepare for it. So we're seeing this a lot right now. Some of you are probably familiar with the DDoS extortion notices that's going on. So a number of organizations globally are receiving these extortion emails. And by having that intelligence prior to, you're in a position where you can evaluate your DDoS mitigations and your capabilities. So when and if that happens, you're ready for it and you're less likely to be severely impacted. Whereas the organizations who are not leveraging that intelligence and they're not aware perhaps of these sorts of campaigns are dealing with it. You know, they get the email and suddenly they're scrambling trying to conduct their incident response. So that's what we're helping a lot of our client organizations do, is determine, first of all, the credibility of the threat, if they are one of the organizations who's received that extortion notice, because the trouble that we have at the moment is there's lots of copycats. So you'll have these, you know, I want to say kid in a basement that hears about this campaign, and they will send a similar email to an organization saying, I'm going to DDoS your network if you don't pay. Now, some of these threats never actually come to fruition, but a number of them do. So by leveraging threat intelligence and comparing those different DDoS extortion notices, you're in a position to understand which ones are real, which ones are not, and which ones you should, you know, I mean, you should always treat them as an incident, but it enables you to better prepare for which ones are likely to actually follow through on that threat.
So Molly, just in an example like that, you know, in terms of just that fact scenario you gave us, what does that look like, practically speaking, from your perspective, when a client calls you with that kind of example?
When they're not aware of that. So for us, typically, it's obviously having conversations with them and getting copies of these sorts of notices. But as obviously a vendor, we have numerous connections globally with law enforcement, other organizations, so we can look at the different notices and understand. We've also got years and years of experience of tracking these threat actors. So we know how it is that they're going to behave. You know, Mark touched on this earlier about typically, you know, when it comes to ransomware, sometimes you'll have your traditional ransomware case, but we're seeing lots of cases more recently where it's ransomware as a service. So the way that happens is you have somebody who does the initial infiltration into the organization, and then you have the secondary actor who deploys the ransomware. So by basically empowering our organizations and they understand that, they know, okay, we might have been hit with ransomware, but we're actually dealing with a second actor or a first actor that we're not aware of. So that's something we're dealing with a lot at the moment, where, you know, organizations, John touched on this earlier, where they try and go it alone. But by engaging intelligence and incident response professionals, you're able to tell them, okay, no, you're not just dealing with ransomware, you're dealing with another actor that you need to get rid of before you bother shutting this down. The other thing, another consideration is, you know, sometimes we'll see incidents, whether it's ransomware or a DDoS attack, that is sort of a beacon over here, but that perhaps might be a cover for espionage. So there's other attacks going on while all of the, you know, the incident response and the IT team have got their focus here. There's other action happening that might be missed. So intelligence basically puts the organization in a position to understand, first of all, who the threat actor is, and if there's perhaps another angle at play here, whether we're dealing with, you know, espionage, is it a financially motivated group, etc.
And there's a really good example. We had two incidents that we've dealt with in the last few months relating to the Revil ransomware, right? One of these incidents we were engaged early in, and of course everyone fixates on the devices have been encrypted, right? The ransomware. But we understand, because we've worked on a lot of these, that there's two threat actors involved. There's one that actually breaks into the organization, gets complete control of the network, and they are the ones that then deploy the Revil ransomware as a service. And it's an affiliate program, so the hackers who break in make money off the extortion. They're two separate groups, though. It's really important to understand that. So the immediate thing, we had one client who dealt with the ransomware. So they recovered their servers, they changed passwords, they got rid of the ransomware, and they actually engaged us, you know, over a week into this incident to help them with the recovery of Active Directory and some of their IT systems. And we started the conversation saying, okay, did you find the first threat actor? Did you find this backdoor and this backdoor and this backdoor? And they hadn't. They had no idea. So the original threat actor still had full access to their environment. And we also know about this threat actor, they come back. So usually before the ransom expires, they come back and they re-encrypt everything. So this company was wide open. The other one that we dealt with, because we had that intel, we knew even before we found evidence on their network, we knew what we were looking for. And so we went about really quickly in the first sort of 3 days, identifying all those backdoors and closing them down so that threat actor couldn't come back. And similarly with the DDoS example that Molly gave, we had a client here in Australia. So this DDoS extortion is now targeting Australian companies, and we're seeing a lot of companies getting hit. And we had one of our clients that had the extortion note, that had the demonstration of the DDoS attack. And one of the things they were grappling with was a lot of conflicting information from different vendors about how serious this threat was, because some organizations who had the threat never got the DDoS and some have. And so what we were able to do was take the ransom note that they had and use threat intelligence from working with other clients around the world to actually authenticate that this ransom note came from the very same attacker that has actually followed through with this DDoS attack on other organizations. So we knew that this was a real threat.
Interesting. Jen,
if you don't mind, Jen, I'm just going to add something on ransomware. Just firstly to say that I think Mark has won the prize for on ransomware bingo. He said it the most. So I was wondering if we'd get through this presentation without saying it more than 50 times. But Mark has shattered that record. But to be frank, it wouldn't be a cyber presentation not to talk about ransomware, particularly with what we've seen over the last 6 to 8 months. Never seen anything like it. The frequency, the severity, big incident types. Mark and Molly have talked about this. It's about encryption of your system. But if you haven't picked this up already, it's now a dual threat. It's encryption of your system. It's also the extraction and the theft of data. If they don't get you to pay to decrypt, they'll try and get you to pay to avoid splashing that data all over the internet. And I used to say probably 3 or 4 months ago that it was in 60% of cases we'd see that data exfiltration, and that has crept up. And I'm now prepared to say 100% of cases we see come across our desk have some element, or at least the threat or the idea of data being accessed or data being exfiltrated. And it's super challenging for businesses. Sitting with boards, sitting at C-suite, and going through the idea of pay, don't pay, and will they pay to avoid data being online. I have seen people do full 180s on this decision, and coming back to the idea of kind of practicing these issues. If you do nothing but just practice that and kick that idea around with your senior management around pay, don't pay, what would you do in that scenario? That will be one of the best hours that you will spend over the next year.
Yeah, and I think that's good advice.
And John, and in our collective experience, right, I think the key thing is understanding how they make that decision, because that's the bit that's challenging. What are all the different inputs that you need and considerations you need to make to actually make that decision is really hard, really tough.
Yeah. Bringing it back just to the concept of this claims discussion, I had a couple of thoughts just as we were listening to this. So I guess the first observation is that when organizations have one attack, they're commonly exposed to repeat attacks by same or new perpetrators. Getting it back to just the claims question, I'd be curious for the panel's views on this. It goes back to this conversation around betterment, and I suppose also a discussion around mitigation. So clients know about that this is a vulnerability, and then we get to this discussion around betterment, and an observation from one of the listeners saying, isn't it in the insurer's interest to help improve a client's systems in order to make them more resilient? I guess is the first one. And then the second question is, just given that this is kind of the threat landscape that we're seeing, and the second question is what about mitigation under an insurance policy? And are these types of, this type of threat intelligence, is this something that a client needs to do in order to mitigate their loss?
Yeah, really good questions. And I suppose I have to answer some of those. They're really quite challenging.
Take a stab at it.
So, yeah. I mean, from my point, and if I miss any of these, please let me know, Jen. But I might start from the last point, if you will, around threat intelligence. Yeah. So insurers panels have evolved over time. Vendors' capabilities have evolved over time, and we're not in the same space that we were 3-4 years ago when this insurance started to become quite popular in Australia. It's now evolved to be a much more hand-in-glove solution, walking hand-in-hand with an insured. Very specifically on the threat intelligence, I think we're going to get to a world where insurers start saying, we have cutting-edge threat intelligence, access to cutting-edge threat intelligence with partners like Accenture and other partners to say, this is what we can give you live feed on things that are going wrong, and for you to have a dedicated person within the organization, 24-hour clock sort of thing almost, to say, respond to these sorts of things. And it's not just going to be your basic generic stuff. It's going to be if everyone remembers the WannaCry incident from a couple of years back, those sorts of flags to say, this is major. We can literally see your servers being encrypted right now, act now, do this, and it will shut it down. I think we will get to a world where that becomes much more common. Excellent insurers will have excellent solutions, and those excellent solutions will be live feed do this now and you are in a better world. So that sort of leads to the mitigation component. Mitigation is sort of in, sort of not in when it comes to cyber. Obviously, if an incident is evolving, and by doing X, it's going to mitigate loss, insurers are usually quite comfortable in accommodating with that. Keeping in mind, as much as this is an issue for the insured to deal with in their own right and as they see best, we're obviously playing potentially with insurers' money to fund that. So the insurers don't necessarily want to pay more if they don't have to. And if it's an easy solution, most insurers will be reasonably accommodating with that sort of stuff. So yes, there is that concept of mitigation, but that's purely in the incident response component. If there's other aspects of this, say customer relationship sort of thing with the mitigation component attaching to that, it starts to get a lot more challenging there. But nonetheless,
I suppose just the general insurance principle of that insureds have to do what's commercially reasonable to mitigate their loss. I think that's a lens that presumably we should always have across this. I don't know, John, if you had any observations in that regard.
Yep. In practical terms, when we're speaking to a client in that first hour, the first 24 hours, 48 hours, we brought Mark and his team, I'm on board, and Molly. It's very common for us now to be dealing with a client who it would almost be impossible to put them back into the position that they were in. And I say that sadly because
right?
times have moved on. They were probably vulnerable to the attack because software was out of date, or the hardware wasn't great in the first place, or whatever that is, or their measures weren't great. So to put a client back into that position, it would actually be impossible to do that. So I think we're seeing insurers just be really practical and really commercial, provided that they're on the journey. And I know I'm like a broken record with this, but provided that they're coming along with you. These insurers, like so many of the insurers, both locally and globally, they want to show off. They've sold the policy. They want to sell more of these policies. The gem for them is actually their claims team. Is actually the person who's saying, hold on, I've got 10 of these exact incidents on the book at the minute. Can we give you insight? Or can we actually get volume for you? Can we get you, a vendor that knows how to do this even quicker than that? So it's this idea of kind of engagement, early engagement, and not being frightened of it. Really, leaning on your incident response manager, leaning with your broker, that collective trio, and bringing your insurer in is super, super important. Anyway, I'm like a broken record at this point.
We've actually got a practical question on the issue of ransomware, which I'm definitely going to give to Mark. And it's a question as to how many companies are paying ransomware, and does this actually improve the outcome of the claim?
That's the $1 million question, no pun intended. But I think we're seeing, and we've done some research on this, we are seeing an increase in companies who are paying, unfortunately. And look, at the end of the day, if companies didn't pay, these folks wouldn't be doing these kinds of attacks, right? So, but we have seen an increase in companies paying in the last 6 months. And I think does it help you get a better outcome? Not necessarily, right? So if the data has been exfiltrated from your environment, whether you pay or not, that data's still gone, and you still have to answer questions around what data and where it's gone and who's got access to it. So that still remains. And bearing in mind that even if you get the encryption keys and the tool to recover your data, as I said before, more often than not, we're looking at multiple threat actors being inside your environment. And there's the group that have actually got that access. Even if you recover the data, you have recovered the data into a compromised environment that they still have access to. And there's no reason as to why they won't monetize that access again. And we've seen examples. I've worked on incidents where attackers have broken into a network. They might have done some ransomware. They might have done some data exfiltration, sold the data. They then sell access to that network to other parties to monetize down the track. So, paying the ransom isn't a shortcut method to get the threat actors out of your environment and get back to a secure environment. It might get your systems up and running a bit faster, but that's about it.
Yeah, I think just to add to that too, Mark, is as well, depending on your country and the local legislations, in some countries it's illegal to pay because, you're essentially funding crime. And then there's also the reputational side of it as well. So regardless of whether you've paid it or not, typically these sorts of things do hit the news quite quickly, because what the threat actor does is, and John touched on this, they have these darknet forums where they're offering the data for sale. So typically they'll publish and saying, hey, we've hit X company, you've got 10 days to pay. And then depending on whether or not they pay, they'll either publish the data in perhaps sections, perhaps months apart, or perhaps they won't publish it. So it can feel a bit like luck of the draw, but yeah, as Mark said, by no means does just paying the ransom put you in a better position at all.
Yeah, I'm just conscious the time has flown, and I'm now suitably alarmed after that discussion. And I thought what we do is we just close it out. I'm going to bring up the last slide here, if you could, in terms of the key takeaways. We've covered these all in the presentation. So what I thought we'd do with our remaining couple of minutes is just go across the panel, and based on the immediacy and urgency of the threat that we've spoken about today, and the fact that, as we've said, it's not if, but when a claim's going to happen, I thought we'd close it off with a bit of a call to arms and ask each of our experts if there's one thing that our listeners should do today after getting off this webinar. What is it? And if each of you could just take a minute to give your key takeaway, that would be really great. And Chris, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think from my point is for to go out and find out when you have an insurance policy, who knows about it and do they understand what it does. And again, to everybody's point, they'll probably say it again, which is communicate, and make sure that you're integrated in all of your approaches.
Right, thanks. Mark, what about on your side?
Yeah, sure. I think, I'd come down to sort of practicing the incident response process, make it more than just a technology thing, though. It needs to extend from the executive right down to technical, and don't just do a simple tabletop where we walk through it, stress test it, right? You need to put the organization under pressure, figure out which vendors you'd engage with, which external legal counsel, what the insurer can provide you, and really bring all of that into that whole simulation. I think it's really important.
Thanks. And John, on your side?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jen. I think it's the onboarding piece that I talked about earlier on. So, taking this time now when things are calm and you're not in crisis to reach out to your broker and reach out to Aon and to get that call together with an incident response manager or the team or some of the vendors, and just figure out who's who and get to meet those people. Because what that will do is it will stimulate further conversations. It will connect people. It will be the start of the journey on bringing everybody together. And critically, the outcome is always better. And then the very last thing I'd say is you're picking up on something that Mark talked about earlier on, which is in the incident response piece, and a plug for mental health. It's super stressful. It's really hard. People work super, super hard when it comes to incident response, and it takes a toll on people. We joke about, refreshing teams and changing teams over, but it is really, really difficult, and businesses need to prepare for this, that it is taxing on the people when an incident happens.
That's a great point, and something that we're dealing with in the COVID world as well. Michael, final thought?
Yeah, it's probably touching on basically what everyone else has said, but it is, in my opinion, two things. The maybe more rapidly understanding that this is not an IT issue, it is a company-wide issue. So getting all of the constituent parts of the business involved in understanding the policy. Many people think this is an IT issue, so the IT people have to, for the first time, look at insurance, and that just does not really mesh. It is a broader, everyone needs to understand this because everyone is involved.
Yeah, there's a big translation exercise that needs to go on. I'm sure we could regale people with those stories as well. And Molly, last but not least, from your perspective.
Thank you. Yeah, I would stress that organizations use threat intelligence to its full capability. Understand the threat actors, what's going on in your industry and your geography, and get ready for it. That puts you in a better position for if an incident happens. And then should the inevitable happen and when you are dealing with an incident, make sure that you engage threat intelligence, because they're the ones who are going to be able to tell you, this is what the threat actor is going to do next, and it puts you in a better position to fight them off.
Excellent. Thanks, Molly, for that. Well, I think we're at the end of the hour. At the end of our hour, I'd like to thank our speakers very much for your contributions. It was a lively discussion, and certainly one that I think has captured our audience. There are a couple of more technical questions which we weren't able to get to, but we will respond to those in writing. So thank you very much for submitting those questions, and we'll get back to you separately on that. But with that, I'd just like to thank everyone very much for their time today, and wish everyone a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.